The Italian Hall by Megan Cummins. Red Jacket, Michigan, July 1913. Calumet and Hecla would not concede. The Western Federation of Mines had sent their demands in a letter, but time passed with no response, so the strike began. On its first day, the copper mines did not operate, with the throng of men outside marching, armed with clubs, throwing stones. Annika did not go to watch her father at the picketing. It was Annika's nature to worry, and she worried more now. The National Guard was on its way to quell the unrest, she had heard, and WFM's national coffers were empty after striking farther west, so that they would not give their support to the Keweenaw chapters. Even the shopkeepers were losing business. In a show of goodwill, the local WFM had opened up stores where union members could buy on credit, taking what little business there was away from the locals. She understood the trouble. Their pay was so low, the work so hard and long, and some of the children so young, and Calumet and Hecla so particular about the way they lived their lives. But she also liked peace, quiet, to sew for the seamstress while her father worked 12-hour shifts, to be alone, which was what she was used to. She had a heart prone to aching, a mind that wandered, and solitude suited these traits best. She and her father lived on the mining camp in a one-room wood frame. It did not have running water, but a well and an outhouse in the back. Their small beds made an L in the corner. It was just the two of them. Their nearest neighbor, a Croatian widow who expressed something like love for Annika, or at least kindly pity. Annika's father gave her money for food every week, which she prepared in the same few ways she remembered from her mother's recipes, and the meals were always meager, but they were what she was used to. But with the strike, the sums grew smaller, and Annika began to go hungry. But she, at least, only had to share food with her father. Her brothers and mother had died of consumption years ago. Sometimes it occurred to her that she was the strongest of the siblings, the only one still living, and she thought, if that were true, then strength must be something rather weak. The widow, Edita, came over one day in early August. Annika had been sweeping the same spot dreamily for several minutes. Edita, what? Annika asked in English, and the widow responded sharply, Your English needs to be better, Annika. Edita spoke well. Her sons, who were grown now and had gone to school longer than most, had taught her. All the English Annika knew she learned from the widow, who corrected her mistakes, which were many. Annika never spoke English unless she had to, and would have preferred not to speak it at all if it hadn't been for the widow's constantly trying to engage her in conversation. The widow knew some Finnish, Annika no Croatian. Edita pulled a chair over to the cabinet. Even standing atop it, she had to strain to reach for Annika's father's whiskey bottle, which was new but half empty already. She grunted her disapproval. The strike will end and he will be fired for drink, she said. Come, Annika, the militia is here. The men throw rocks at the arriving trains as though they will turn around. Annika and Edita walked to the mines to see the picket broken by guardsmen on horseback. Men on the ground had already begun to assemble tents. Some were laughing, laying casual claim to the land. I wonder what Moyer will say, Annika said. Moyer. The widow made that sound in her throat again. A criminal, but our leader. Annika's father did not come home that night, and so, in the early dawn, she walked north on Mine Street, past the shaft houses and the central school and the company houses scattered among them. She kept walking until she reached Dunn's Bar. Her father was asleep outside. Annika heard a low rumble, and she looked up to see the sky was a heavy gray color. Small tendrils like loose threads hung down from the clouds. Isa, Annika said, get up. Drool had run down his chin, and he snorted and mumbled a little, but stayed asleep. Annika noticed his nose hairs needed trimming. She sat down next to him and waited for the rain to begin. Annika's mother had died so long ago that Annika grew up unaware that the drinking was excessive, having seen no mother fret over his red eyes, reach out for the leftover pennies. She recognized Edita's disapproval, but the rumors had begun elsewhere. They said her father loved the strike, wished to see the issues unsolved, all day in Dunn's bar in meetings. Annika's shrinking figure only gave them fodder, the poor girl with the drunken father. It's not true, Annika had insisted meekly to the seamstress who liked to ask questions. Her father was a good man who wanted a just world. He had lost everything except for her, and she wasn't much. It must be good to be in the Union and to have a family again. The first few drops splashed Annika's face. The rain grew fierce, and her father was startled awake. He didn't say anything, but they both stood and started homeward, Annika's hems gathering the mud. She looked back to the doorway of Dunn's to see Charles Moyer watching them go. The whole town was bare bones. To make things worse, Annika turned that month 15 and felt she was old enough to claim to be in love with Jacob Koski. And at first, love and despair felt similar to her, both some kind of starvation. But then the soups she cooked for herself and her father became so thin they were not much more than warm water, and hunger became impossible to conflate with heartache. Her bleeding stopped, and then she woke up with clumps of hair on her pillow. Still, she loved Jacob, though she couldn't tell her father. Jacob and his family still worked. He was a trammer in the mines. She watched him walk past their house early as she swept the porch or pumped the well, always saying hello. Once he left his lunch pail on her walkway and she ran it after him. They began to meet in secret. She listened with one ear to the things Jacob said, her mind only following what struck her as beautiful. "We live on a pit of money," he said once, after describing the good quality of the ore under Red Jacket. Annika imagined coppery tendrils growing beneath her like a system of roots. Jacob made it sound easy. But all around them, the money was locking up, becoming harder to get. Annika was aware that she didn't agree with Jacob, but she also didn't think that would matter. The strike would end, an agreement would be reached. Things were hard now and might get harder, but she would survive. Annika examined her hands, poked to pieces by her sewing needle. She'd been lost in abstraction as she sewed her last dress for the seamstress, who had told her there would be no more work. The town no longer had the money to mend their clothes, let alone have new made. The last dress commissioned was for Mother Jones, who visited Red Jacket in August and marched in a parade, something silk with a hobble skirt, which the matron hadn't liked, but she paid the full $4.75, more than twice what the miners made in a day. While the old mother had given a speech near the mines, Annika stood behind the Koskis. Jacob's father heckled Mother Jones, saying she was the grandmother of all rioters, while Jacob reached back and held Annika's hand discreetly in the crowd. Annika had heard her father call the Koskis scabs, and when she repeated this to Jacob, he spat on the ground. "Your father's a fool." A blizzard came in September that knocked down the National Guard's tent city and sent the peacekeepers downstate. No one had liked the militia while they were there, but right after they left, Calumet and Hecla brought in their own team from a company called Waddell. They'd been hired to intimidate. The Waddell men were thugs. Everyone wished for the Guard back. Annika's dress hung loosely, the muslin gone ragged, and her ribs showed through her skin as though she were a fossil brushed nearly clean. When the snow let up, Annika walked to the mines to watch the copper ore, in substantially smaller amounts, but business dragged on, loaded onto trains to be hauled to the smelter. From there, the copper would be transferred to barges and sent out onto Lake Superior before the weather really set in. Jacob met her, and they kissed, and he gave her a rind of bread he'd taken from his mother's kitchen. Annika hinted to him that she was hungry, although she'd hoped he would have guessed on his own. But still, he'd begun to bring her scraps, and with the extra food, Annika had begun menstruating again, and her breastbone was covered with a thin layer of fat, as though blowing snow had settled there. Management likes Finns. Better than Italians, better than Croats or Irish. Why shake your fists at what you've got? Jacob said. Annika bit her lip. With the new machinery, it takes one man to do the work it used to take two. So if labor's equalized, if they give positions to everyone equally, we'll be the ones losing our jobs. Annika knew her father wouldn't agree. The first day the management had replaced a two-person drill with the smaller one, he'd come home in terrible pain. She'd wrapped warm cloths around his blistered hand, given him broth for his throat. He looked more and more like he belonged underground. Dirty and dark, his eyes red in the light. But Jacob smiled when he spoke. Only his hands, when he touched her, were rough. Annika walked home from the mines in a light snow to see Edita waiting on the porch. The widow's husband had died in a fire in the mines nearly 15 years ago. During the inquest, the coroner deemed the miners themselves responsible, claiming they'd stopped to eat their lunches during the evacuation. Upon first hearing the story when she was a child, Anna had felt something in her diaphragm she would feel again. A feeling she conjured when Jacob was speaking about the strike, or when she was the most hungry and wished her father would go back to work. "That boy is no good for you," Edita said when Annika approached her house. She was waiting on the porch and looked at Annika with her squinty, leaky eyes. She kept talking, but Annika noticed a dusting of flour on Edita's apron, and she hoped the widow would pull something sweet from her pocket, like she had when Annika was younger and Edita had spoiled her. But the widow had nothing, and Annika nearly choked on saliva trying to remember the taste of sugar. "What are you sputtering about?" the widow said. "If your mother were alive, she would tell you this too." Edita tore away a piece of paper that had been nailed to Annika's railing and handed it to her. "Give your father that notice," the widow said as she gathered her skirts to leave. "He loves you," she added. "He wasn't raised to think he would ever be a father without a wife." The notice was in English. Eviction, Annika sounded out. She didn't know the word, but would try to remember to ask the widow later. But then she saw the C&H seal in the corner. She tore it up and let the pieces fall. Later, her father came home from Dunn's Bar, furious. Annika was supposed to be in town with everyone else that day, a parade for the children of the striking miners. He'd made her a sign. "Papa is striking for me," but Annika had forgotten. Her father spent most of his time these days at the union headquarters, or right next door at Dunn's Bar, where he kept a tab. Their house was near Bethlehem Lutheran, beyond which the mines spread out, and smokestacks puffed thick black smoke, which dissipated and looked like a smudge of ink against the sky. Annika went out back to pump some water to find Jacob waiting by the well. They went inside. The fire in the hearth was low and the house cold, but Jacob took off her dress, her boots, her stockings. He pushed it all aside, but Annika let a hand fall toward the pile and held onto a button on the bodice, loosening the thread until it slipped from its shank. By the time they finished, the water they had poured into the cast iron pot over the fire had barely come to a simmer. Jacob took an onion from his pocket and set it on the table. Annika didn't even wait for him to leave before she tore it into chunks and added it to the soup, and when her father asked later where she'd gotten it, fresh vegetables were hard to come by during winter, brought in sometimes only by rail, she said she'd found it on the ground near the tracks. Annika felt something feverish come over Jacob, and his love become pushy. He suggested they elope to get away from the Union, her father. He went on about lazy workers and men who did nothing but smoke all day. He started whenever Annika interrupted him to say something, and so she mostly stayed quiet. She was afraid of him. Did she love him still? She certainly did not like him. How could such a beautiful boy turn so dark? She wanted to leave Red Jacket, but not with him. On Halloween, the town had a bonfire in the square, and everyone gathered around, wearing clothes more ragged than the year before. At home, they'd stifled their hearths, to be relit later with torches taken from the community fire. This year, more than ever, they all seemed eager. Their cheeks rosed. Though Annika looked around and saw the Koskis weren't there, nor other families still at work. Things were divided this way now. Annika supposed no one could help it. The snow in the town had already been piled up to Annika's knees on the sidewalk. She could feel her fingers losing blood to the rest of her hand, and she loosened the tips of her gloves and balled them into a fist, the fingers hanging limply now. Her father sang songs with the rest of them, and Annika let her own small voice out a little, so quiet it barely left her throat. Through the fire, Annika could see someone careening down the dark street. He slipped once, but was up, running again toward the crowd before he had even completely risen. He came with news from Seaborville. The widow's sons had been shot dead by Waddell men for cutting across company property on their way to their boarding house. Edita stood near the flame and said nothing, only gathered up her skirts and began to walk home. The pile of torches near the fire went unlit. No one wanted to bring such bad luck home with them. The widow asked Annika to be one of the brides in the funeral, a Croatian tradition since death had cut her son's marriage proposal short. The widow brought out her own wedding dress, and Annika mended the moth holes in the cold. Her father sat with her at the wooden table and drank warmed water. He reached down and picked a button off the floor, handing it over to Annika, thinking most likely that it had come from the widow's dress. Annika blushed and thanked him. The whole town went down to Seaborville. Even Charles Moyer was there. He approached Annika and her father before the procession and spoke to them, though Annika was too startled to listen closely, and she didn't understand much. He had a thin, taut face and thick mustache. The boy's white hearse was pulled by thoroughbreds and followed by Annika and 10 other girls, her maids, dressed and veiled all in white. She saw Jacob in the crowd, his head capped and his hands in his pockets. He had forbidden her to agree to the widow's request, grabbing her arm so hard it left a bruise when she turned away from him without answering. Afraid of Jacob coming to her during the day when she was alone, she had asked her father for a job to do. She sat in the cold corner of the Union headquarters and stamped envelopes or sprinkled pounce on wet ink. Charles Moyer had given her letters to write, and when she struggled with the words as he had dictated, he had taken the pen away and patted her hand. The wheels of the carriage rolled on in the dirt, but barely made a sound. It was the quietest procession Annika had ever been in. She thought of the strike's beginning. In the warm months, when Mother Jones had walked in the parade and a band had played. Now, Annika noticed her toes turning brittle. The widow's hem had already turned brown. The widow widow was the first to suggest that Annika was pregnant. "But don't worry," she said. "The baby will not live. You are barely alive." Annika's father was sick, forced back to the house because of his lungs. He bought a bottle of whiskey on credit, and when Annika tipped it into his tea, he grabbed the bottle from her. By late evening, it was gone. "Moyer's eyes linger on you," he had said while drunk, and he sounded proud. Annika kept the fire going. She wondered if the child inside of her was even alive anymore. She'd heard of wealthier women on diets of fresh fruit during their pregnancy, regimens of leisurely walks. The widow promised to keep her secret. She hadn't spoken to Jacob since before the funeral, though when she did see him, the mines looked as though they were settling in his bones. His face was gaunt and hung loose on his skull. While her father slept, she wrote him a note, using paper and ink from the union office. She considered what her father had said and wrote Moyer a note too. She was in a certain situation, she said, and she needed his help. Her family was small and had gotten overlooked often, and now they needed assistance with food. She had hoped her vagueness would be mistaken for another lost wrangle with English, and that Moyer wouldn't guess what the situation really was. She left it for him at the union office, but when she went there to work the next day, it was gone from his desk, and there was no sign of him. The letter to Jacob, Annika had delivered through the widow. 2 weeks passed before she heard word from him. She was to meet him on Christmas Eve on the steps of the Lutheran church at 8:30. When Annika's father began to feel better, released from his haze of whiskey and illness, he told her the union was having a Christmas party at the Italian Hall. "I feel the end of all this coming soon," he said, giving Annika a rare smile. "They'll have pasties there for everyone, and we can eat our fill," he said. Then he paused before going on. "Moyer will be there, I'm sure. He asks after you now and then." On Christmas Eve, Annika promised her father she'd meet him at the party. The widow, she said, needed help with something, but once outside, Annika ran through the cold and was breathless by the time she arrived at the dark hollow of the church's entrance. No service tonight. Everyone was at the party. Annika stood, nervous, but the feeling was good since it took the edge off her hunger, and when her legs grew tired, she sat down. But the steps froze to her thighs, so she stood again, but she felt no warmer. A finger turned white, and she rubbed it to bring its color back. Jacob was late, and Annika touched her stomach worriedly. He had a long temper, and she suddenly regretted telling him. But relief bloomed in her lungs as she saw a figure approach. But it was not Jacob. It was Moyer. A cigarette hung from his mouth, and Annika walked near him, hoping to inhale the smoke, which made her feel a little more alive. "My letter," Annika said, and tried to think of what to say next, but in her mind the words ran past in a jumble of Finnish. Moyer nodded, then, "I think you should tell your father, my dear." Annika faltered. The embers on his cigarette burned out slowly, and Annika watched them one by one. She understood she could not argue, so she only nodded. Moyer twisted the end of his cigarette and went to put it in his pocket, but it slipped instead to the ground. Annika's eyes followed it. "I have one more question," Moyer said, but Annika interrupted. "Ask it slowly," she said. Moyer nodded. "It isn't right of me to ask, but I feel I must. The child, does it belong to your father?" Well, Annika was too stunned to respond, and during her silence, Moyer began to walk away. "No," she shouted after him. "Koski, the Koski boy." Moyer turned to study her, and from the look on his face, she thought she had given him worse news. Annika waited until he had turned the corner before she dropped to her knees and her hands beetled around the icy ground in search of his cigarette. When she found it, she unrolled the paper and put the tobacco in her mouth and let the dry leaves sit on her tongue. Jacob had not come. She was still on the ground when from downtown she heard the first loud cry of, "Fire!" A single voice that echoed in the cold, then again. And it faded as Annika ran from the church and rounded the corner to see the Italian hall lit with lamps inside, but not ablaze. The sound of its revelers faltered, the music stopped, and the joy turned to panic. Annika started closer but stopped. Outside the double doors stood two large men, holding them shut. The hall had only one entrance, which opened to a set of stairs. Annika heard the screams begin, the pounding of the bodies against the door, and she ran again toward the men, but someone caught her arm and pulled her back. It was Jacob, she realized when she turned, and he hissed for her to shut up. She pulled her arm sharply away. The Italian hall trembled with people trying to force their way out. There was no fire. When the noise quieted, the men holding the doors left, walking away down the street as though they'd only stopped to observe a mild scene. When Annika turned to where Jacob had been, he was gone. Annika woke up in the widow's house and remembered what had happened the night before. 75 people had died in the stampede, most of them children. She'd spent the night carrying their small bodies to the town hall, where they were laid out on long tables like dolls, like bars of copper waiting to be shipped. The dead adults, big mining men, ones Annika had thought invincible, were taken out on stretchers. Annika had avoided the part of the room where her father lay. She told the police what she had seen. She spelled out Jacob's name, K-O-S-K-I, a damn scab. But no one ever wrote anything down. The next day, when she returned home, there were $60 shoved under her door. The strike ended a few days into the new year, not long after the disaster. Those alive had still been crushed by it. Moyer demanded Calumet and Hecla give up the names for those responsible, and Annika wrote to tell him about Jacob. But Moyer was beaten and shot in the back in a town nearby in January, Annika heard, and forced on a train to Chicago. She had not heard if he had lived. Annika spent the rest of her pregnancy with the widow, who only now seemed determined that the baby survive. She spoon-fed her broth and apologized again and again for predicting the child will die. "I think he will be all right," she said. "I think so." The baby was born in late spring, a little boy Annika called Isaac. She walked with the widow and her child through the town, its patchwork of storefronts and the sounds of industry churning again, though Ford had just announced his $5 workday and people began to trickle down the state. Isaac had survived, but the town would not. But for now, she could work again for the seamstress. There was no longer a crowd of men outside of Dunn's. The union store had gone, taking the tabs with it. The strike was over. It had failed. She had her photograph taken with Isaac, out on the street with the smokestacks in the background. She was sober-faced, and the baby looked startled. She sometimes saw Jacob, but she ignored him, though the widow would spit on his shoes. When Annika fell ill with consumption, the same thing that had taken her mother and brothers, he didn't come to see her. She recovered briefly before her death, as most with the disease did, and walked out in the spring chill and did not feel the cold. She felt shrouded in light. The darkness, her light. Like the widow's boys who were denied wives, Annika let out a shuddering of all the life she would miss, gone fast like a smoldering piece of paper. She stood by the Koski's gate in only a nightgown. She had always been pretty, she thought, as she touched her cheeks with both hands, even arresting to look at, like a copper ceiling. She died outside Jacob's window. After his mother found her, the family blamed it on lore, the idea that victims of consumption were so drained of life because they'd been possessed, drawn to nightly revels with the spirits. It had been Annika's last rasp of life, a final dance with ghosts. Red Jacket, Michigan, May 1917. Jacob Koski only acknowledged his child once in order to dodge the draft. A widower could defer, though Edita had taken care of Isaac since Annika had died. It didn't help him much, though, and in fact he might have had more luck in the trenches. One day in the mines he sat and warmed a stick of dynamite with a candle. "I know what I'm doing," he said, when others warned him. A bit of paper burned off, and the sparks nestled down into a box of exploding caps on the ground next to Jacob. After all he had done for Calumet and Hecla, the inquest read, "One Koski, dead of explosion by own foolishness. Terrible hole in throat, right eye gone."